Hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Tan Sien Lee. I'm from the Law Faculty and Center for International Law at LUS. Welcome to our lecture this afternoon, The End of 100 Years of the Pax Americana, Reasons and Geopolitical Implications. This lecture is brought to you by the NUS Center for International Law and the Singapore chapter of the International Law Association. Professor Weiler and I are very happy and grateful to Mr. George Yeo for accepting our invitation to moderate this lecture. We are also very grateful to Alan and Gledhill, especially Mr. Min Nai Wu, for providing us with this auditorium for the lecture. And also, Alan and Gledhill is hosting the reception afterwards. I would like to invite Mr. Min to welcome all of you.
Thanks very much. Very good afternoon, Mr. George Yeo, Professor Joseph Weiler, distinguished guests, I think some colleagues as well here. Welcome to Gledhill. We are very pleased to host you here as a firm that's really plugged into the international networks and with offices across the region. International law is something that we are very conscious about, and we're very, very happy to host the CIL ILE event here at our auditorium. So, Mr. Yeo used to be my boss at the Ministry of Trade and Industry a lifetime ago, and I'm very interested to hear, obviously, about the topic that Professor Weiler is going to be speaking on today, since we were actually very deeply involved in the negotiation of the Singapore-US Free Trade Agreement, and it'll be interesting to see how from there we moved to this era that we find ourselves in right now. So without further ado, may I just hand over to Cindy, and can I invite you all to enjoy the lecture and the refreshments after that. Thank you very much.
Both our distinguished guests have very long CVs, but let me give you a summary. Okay, as many of you might already know, Professor Weiler is University Professor at New York University School of Law, where he holds the Joseph Strauss Chair and the Jean Monnet Chair, and he runs the respective research centers there. At NUS, Professor Weiler is Center for International Law's co-head of the ASEAN Law and Policy Program. For Mr. George Yeo, he's currently a visiting scholar at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and he's founding patron of its Asia Competitiveness Institute. Mr. Yeo served 23 years in the Singapore government and was Minister for Information and the Arts, Minister for Health, Minister for Trade and Industry, and Minister for Foreign Affairs. With that, Professor Weiler, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, George, for agreeing to be here. It's quite intimidating for me to give a lecture on foreign policy with the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore sitting next to me. But I told him that at the end of my presentation, he should feel free to say quite openly why everything I said is wrong. That would be interesting. The economic sphere. And here, the American role was also decisive during the American century. The establishment of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, a multilateral trading system. These are American inventions. They would not happen without them. They would not happen without their support in treasure, politically, etc. And of course, for good or for bad, the dollar became the reference currency in the world, which was, of course, to a huge American advantage because they could borrow money as they wished. They were borrowing in dollars. It wasn't, everything was by reference to the dollar. And I want to say something about the American economy, the strength of the American economy. The strength of the American economy, if we go back, say, to the 50s, etc., it was still a productive powerhouse. You see that even within the American economy. In 1955, if you bought a camera, a television, a radio, any consumer durable, it would have been made in the United States. But that's not the source of American economic leverage. American economic leverage came because of their huge consumption power. 2/3 of industrial goods produced in the world were consumed by the United States and United States consumer. That gave them leverage because American prosperity brought about the prosperity of others because it was such a huge market. It's worth remembering that really the American economic might was because of that sucking consumer. We are consumed, and therefore our policies will affect the prosperity everywhere. Why is America, and for that matter the European Union, the regular defendant in the World Trade Organization? Because if Guatemala raises illegally a custom duty or has a discriminatory tax, who cares? If America has a discriminatory tax or protectionist measure of American steel, it affects India, it affects every country in the world because of that huge sucking. So we can see also that the economic system and the security system were marked by American influence, by American design, and the ability of America to contain, not absolutely, but to contain threats to that order which was established, both economically and security-wise. So now I pass on, and I want to explain what we all feel intuitively, that probably, as I say, it's still a superpower, it's militarily probably still the most important power. Not numerically, the Chinese fleet is larger than the American fleet, but qualitatively, it's still like that. It's still an economic superpower. It's still a very influential state, but it doesn't quite have the same containing power and the same shaping power. How does this come about? So there are two theses here, and one really must keep in mind two theses. One thesis is, even if nothing changed within the United States, it's the development elsewhere in the world which made its relative power decline. So even if America went on functioning just as before, its relative power declines. But in addition, there was American dysfunctionality, which aggravated this process. So let's discuss these two things. And I want to start with something which maybe would resonate in Singapore. And it would surprise you that I mention this as the first factor, and it's demographics. What do I mean by demographics? Compared to an India, if you take India, Brazil, and China together, 300 million Americans is a small number of people. By comparison, we're talking about more than 2 billion vis-a-vis 300 million. So how does one explain American might, economically, security? It's the understanding, and this is why I think it might resonate in Singapore, that the most precious asset is human capital. It's human capital through education, through universities, through training, quality governance, etc., which explained American relative superiority. Now, if we look at India, if we look at China, if we look at Brazil, etc., it's not the same environment of 1950, 1960, 1970. There's a huge change. It sounds very instrumental and mechanical, but you'll understand that I say this with respect, in the quality of the human capital, the educational system in these countries, etc. And suddenly, whereas before it didn't matter if it was 1.5 billion against 300 million, if people were living in poverty, uneducated, etc., it's a totally different environment. The largest group of master students that are in my university come from China. And they're not only the largest in number, they are the best among all the master students from around the world, very high quality, coming with good education from Chinese universities. So it's the demographic human quality that has changed and has relativized this dimension of American superiority. If we look now at the economic dimension, and you remember that I said that American economic might derives from its consumption power. In the year 2000, if you ask the CEO of Daimler-Benz, of Siemens, of any of the major European giants, if you had to choose, hypothetically, between the American market and the Chinese market, it will take them 1 nanosecond to say, I choose the American market. In 2023, if you pose that question, hypothetically, if you had to choose between the American market or the Chinese market, it won't be a nanosecond. They will need a few hours, days, or weeks to think about it. And it's probably, they would say, if we were pushed, we would vote for China. The economic development in China makes it a much more attractive market for our products. That's a sea change. Now, in addition to that, American productive capacity of actual goods has disappeared. The American economy is, for the most part, a service economy. And I want to go back to the victory in the Cold War, so to speak. You know, that high moment of American military dominance. You know what the price it came at under President Reagan? Under President Reagan, America shifted from being the biggest creditor country in the world to being the biggest debtor country in the world. And you understand that from a geopolitical economic point of view, that's huge. Its main rival holds a huge amount of American debt. It's not without consequence. So on the one hand, a decline in productive capacity. The Americans, in terms of production, they produce large aeroplanes, Boeing and Airbus in Europe, powerhouse for military hardware. But what's the next thing? We have to think. The richest comes from a service economy, from software, from the entertainment industry, from movies, etc. But there is a consequence that in terms of production, China has long overtaken America as the production powerhouse of the world. It's not only that. And now we have to look at two internal developments in the United States, which have, in my view, decisive importance in explaining the shift in American ability to shape the world, American ability to contain. American politics has changed. There was always a divide since the Civil War, between the Republicans and the Democrats on major issues in American society. But there used to be consensus on foreign policy. Take whatever view you want of the second American intervention in Iraq. It had the support of an overwhelming majority in the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. For reasons which maybe we can talk in the Q&A, America has become polarized to a degree which is unknown. And that has spilled over into foreign policy. In other words, there is no consensus of foreign policy, and Congress does not worry about American credibility in terms of foreign policy. One president can sign a treaty, and the next president can just undo that treaty. See Iran. See the Trans-Pacific. It was negotiated, and then they just withdrew. So, in terms of American position in the world, suddenly to a degree much greater than before, polarization of American society, in other words, Republicans and Democrats are fighting each other also over foreign policy, policy towards Ukraine, etc. This is new, and the world takes note of that. It takes note of that it undermines, it doesn't destroy, but it undermines, it compromises long-term American commitments, because they are subject to the vagaries of American internal politics. Do you want to see a sharp example of that? One of the greatest assets of the United States as an economic power is that American paper, American bonds, treasury bonds signed by the United States used to be the most stable thing where to park your money. Because no one could ever imagine that America would renege on its debts. My word is my bond works here very well to describe the situation. In any moment of crisis, people will run and buy America treasury paper as a safe haven, better than gold. And now, not for the first time, we are facing the threat of a default on American debt. Now, it's a technical default. It's not like Argentina. Nobody doubts the ability of the United States to service its debt. So it's not that kind of default that the economy has run into the ground and they can't pay. But the fact that domestic policy would be used to undermine one of the greatest assets of American economic power, treasury bonds are safer than any other asset, is an illustration of this change that Democrats, Republicans, when it comes to foreign policy, we act as the United States. And we understand the virtue of American commitments towards other countries, towards the world, that have to be respected, even if I had voted against it when I was in opposition. That is also being undermined by this development. And the fourth element that has changed is the moral standing of the United States. During the Cold War, one could like the Americans, dislike the Americans, but they still had the mantle of protectors of the free world. And yeah, interestingly, winning the Cold War, when, okay, it's over, etc., increasingly one begins to question America's moral commitments. Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, a whole range of activities where suddenly they don't look so upright as the defenders of democracy, liberty, etc. It's not disastrous, it's not an autocratic state, etc. But the moral critique, the United States' moral credibility, uprightness, the defender of the free world, is no longer there. Now, everything I said, because we have a tendency to say Trump, Trump, Trump. I'm not a fan of Trump. In no way. In fact, it's shocking to me that democracy could produce that as the President of the United States. But the processes I'm describing are not Trump-produced. They already begin under the Obama regime. And now I want to illustrate this. So I want to now give you some examples of the word decline, the different positioning of America, which leads me to say the end of the Pax Americana or the end of the American century. Let's think of some examples. Middle East. President Obama goes to Cairo. He gives one of the most interesting and inspiring speeches, among which is there can be no more Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. What happened to that? it's in the power of the United States to stop those settlements. For all kinds of internal political reasons, they didn't. And the door is practically shut on the possibility of a two-state solution. It's still possible, but much, much more complicated had the Obama commitment been honored when it was given. The red line in Syria, if they use chemical weapons, that's a red line. What happened to that? Iran, Georgia and Izvestia, Crimea, and of course Ukraine now. I'm giving you examples where you see that things that might have been unthinkable. In 1956, in the Sinai War, the American president called the Israelis and said, you have to be out of there in 6 months, and that's what happened. In the Madrid process, James Baker calls them and said, we are freezing American guarantees to Israeli debt, and that brought the end of that. But that's no longer the case. Iran will be a nuclear power. Crimea, even Ukraine, America is definitely helping in material about 10 times more than the Europeans. But it happened. The containing power is not. And now some examples from the economic sphere. As I said, in the heyday of the American century, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the GATT system, etc., understanding that American prosperity is connected to prosperity of the world, and that free trade, not quite as advanced as you have in your country, but will contribute to American prosperity as it did to Singaporean prosperity. And where are we now? The agreement between the European Union and the United States tanked. America withdraws from the Trans-Pacific, which was a major achievement of Mrs. Clinton as Secretary of State. And they are undermining the WTO, emasculating the WTO. What is happening to the multilateral economic system? So I've just given you some examples, both on these two axes of power. Now, I repeat for the third time, make no mistake, it's a superpower, both economically and militarily. And if any country should attack the United States, woe to them. It's a country of warriors. They've been going to war practically every 10 years somewhere around the globe. But it's not the same actor that we described in the American century. We are shaping the world actor. It's more inward looking. For example, the new crisis with the European Union over tax credits. It's abandoning multilateral commitment or multilateral prospects. And in a way, it's self-understanding, and I say this with caution. Its self-understanding of its role in the world is also slowly changing. Yes, we have to look over American interests, but less shaping the world as we think the world should be. There's less of a commitment to that. So now I come to an end with geopolitical implications. I think the thing that worries me most, first of all, it is a less stable world we are living in today. It's a less stable world economically, it's a less stable world security. Both Europe, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, it's a less stable world. We can muddle through, we can manage, we can hope for change, etc., but it's uphill. In other words, whether we like the policies or not, the kind of stability and containment that the American produced in the American century is frayed. But I have a deeper existential fear. And I want to end where I began, with the First World War. Here's a book that I recommend to everybody to read. It's called Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. It's about how the First World War came about. And why has it got that name, Sleepwalkers? Because if you had asked any European leader in February, March, April of 1914, you know that in August of this year, in 6 months, there will be a world war, they would laugh at you. Now, what do we learn from that experience? And this is what frightens me. We all know that it was not the shooting of the Archduke in Serbia that was the cause of the First World War. What he explains so beautifully, and now I'm giving it my terminology, it's salami. It's not a major crisis. It's a little slice here, and a little slice here, and a little slice here. Every slice in itself is not a casus belli. It's not a major crisis. But slowly, the balance of power that existed leading up to 1914, through the salami process, eroding faith, credibility of the mechanisms which were ensuring stability leading up to 1914 disappear. And then suddenly the last salami and the thing collapses. And that's my fear today. So I'm dramatizing it, that we might be sleepwalking, that there won't be a explosion, but there's the process of salami, the erosion of credibility in international institutions and in the United States. So think about it. I don't know the answer if the United States would go to the help of Poland or go to the help of Taiwan if a war breaks out. I don't know. But I think that most people would say, I don't know. And it's that I don't know that has changed the world and has ended the American century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Weiler. And Mr. Yeo is not only a statesman, but he is a deep intellectual. So we invite Mr. Yeo for his responses.
I thank the Center for International Law and Professor Weiler for inviting me to moderate this session. It was a complete surprise to me. My connection to Professor Weiler is he was a former president of the European University Institute, and I'm now an international advisor to its School of Transnational Governance, of which I think he's responsible. Paternity suit.
I plead guilty.
So I'm delighted to be here and very honored to have been asked. I immediately, when I received the email, Googled you. And of course, it's a very long list of his accomplishments in law, which my eyes glazed over, not being a lawyer. But two things, bookending his accomplishments in law, caught my eye. First, he's a Jew from South Africa. And our first honorary citizen, Sydney Brenner, was a Jew from South Africa. And in fact, I wrote a cabinet paper recommending that we create such a category of citizenship, specifically with Sydney Brenner in mind. And before we could implement it, he won the Nobel Prize. And people thought that we gave it to him because he won the Nobel Prize. But anyway, we were too slow. We should have been faster. And at the other end of the bookshelf is the fact that last year he won the Ratzinger Prize for theology, and the first Jewish scholar to win that prize. That really aroused my curiosity. Then I read how he defended the right of Italian Catholic schools to hang crucifixes in classrooms before the European Court. And he declared himself a committed pluralist. Then we're after your own heart in Singapore, because we too are committed pluralists. I heard, and I think many of us heard with some fascination, you being an American, talking about the decline of the US and the decline of Pax Americana. I think for many of us, we listen to it with a certain heaviness of heart. Because many of us will have spent time living the US or studying the US and have grown an affection for the US. And however you described it, under the Pax Americana, Singapore was able to pole vault from the third world to the first world. Without that larger stability, without the depoliticization of trade in GATT, in the WTO, without a system of audits, of dispute resolutions, or enforcement, we couldn't have taken off. And what drove it? Well, a lot of it, American consumption. To some extent, American and Japanese multinationals in the initial period of our growth. It's more diversified now. In the last few years, America has changed. I think for us in Singapore, in one area, it's changed dramatically, which is its attitude towards China. I think it bothers a lot of us here a lot. How America is trying, by all means, fair and foul, to somehow contain, bring down China. Resentful of its rise, and feeling threatened by it. And when American leaders come to our part of the world, where they interact with governments here in Southeast Asia, it's almost always as if there's a third party in the room, who is the main concern of American diplomacy, and not us. That bothers people a lot. People worry about it a lot, because if there's conflict, we'll be severely affected. I had my initial career in the armed forces. I was the head of Air Force plans. I bought American planes and missiles and military systems. Something happens, how do we fly our F-15s, F-16s? American ships and aeroplanes use Singapore bases. Will they be allowed to strike Chinese assets? I hope not, but I don't know. And if we were to say no, how will the US react to us? Because once the camel's in the tent, can we get it out? What about financial system? Some of us were somewhat surprised when Singapore took sanctions against Russia when the Ukraine war broke out. Narrow sanctions, but measures which surprised not only the Europeans, surprised also the Americans. Did we have to do it? Why did we do it? We have since shifted our position a little. But I think everyone is anticipating big shifts in the world, and we're deciding in that shift how we should navigate our own ship of state so that we don't get harmed in the process. We try to hide behind a larger regional grouping, ASEAN, but sometimes not very effectively. But thank you so much, Professor Weiler, for being so forthright, honest in the assessment of your own country. I think we appreciate that a lot. And may I invite members of the audience to ask your questions and to give your views.
So we have Daphne and then maybe I'll just start. Thanks very much for your candid sharing. I found your talk extremely sobering. My question is this: you concluded that it is not so much Trump that has brought about the state of affairs, but rather it is causes of the demography, etc. So I'm wondering, when you describe the end of what you call the American century, thereby leaving what I sense to be a vacuum in the world order, what do you think will fill this order? What I found very, very sobering, when you ended your sharing with sleepwalkers, which I understood to mean that we may unwittingly, that there may be changes or events that may even result in possibly a third World War. I don't know whether that's what you meant, but I got the impression that that is what you're worried about. So, but to tie my point, if America is no longer the big superpower playing this leveling role in the international order, what do you think will fill this gap? Is it necessarily that the world cannot accommodate two superpowers? So I wanted to hear your views on that. What do you think? I mean, is it really we are all headed towards such troubling times that we are even looking at the possibility of a world war? Or is it possible after some time that the world can accommodate two superpowers?
So it's a question about US and China.
Yeah. I also have a question for Mr. Yeo. In the sense of what lessons do you think we can draw, right, from this state of affairs, looking at ourselves in this part of the world, from a demography point of view, it is also not great for Singapore. So just wondering, are there forces at play which are actually beyond any country, any democracy, such that Singapore, of course, you describe it as we voted from third world to first world. Are there also lessons to be learned such that will there come a point in time where we're seeing the beginning of the end of Singapore as we know it? Thank you.
So on your main question, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not very good at gazing into the crystal ball. But this is not a cop-out, because I think the end of the American century, the main problem is the instability and that we don't know. It could go in any direction. The world can support two superpowers. It did this throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union, the Second World, and the First World. So, but there was a tacit understanding among the two superpowers of how to manage that rivalry, etc. And from that perspective, it doesn't look as if the Chinese and the Americans are saying, okay, we are two superpowers, we will never make this public, but we're going to divide the world, we will have our spheres of influence, there will be flashpoints here and there, which is basically how the Cold War was managed. It's the uncertainty that I find dangerous, and it could go in any direction. So at one level, it's an unsatisfying answer, but it's the very fact that one cannot predict which makes the situation worrying to me. Because it could be stability, but the human race has acted irrationally so many times in the past. So who is to say that they won't act irrationally again? Was the Second World War a rational thing? Was the First World War a rational thing? So it's the uncertainty that worries me. But I want to say something about Trump. We talk a lot about democratic slide, Poland, Hungary, Israel, India, etc. And when we talk about democratic slide, we say they are threatening the independence of the judiciary, they're threatening the rule of law, they're rigging elections, etc. There's a much greater danger to democracies than those things, bad as they are. Think of the word democracy. It's in the word democracy, there's the word demos. It's the rule by the people. And the way democracy functions, I might be a convinced Republican, and you might be a convinced Democrat. I might be a convinced Christian Democrat, you might be a convinced socialist. But we are all American, we are all German, we are all Spanish, we are all Italian, And we understand the rules of the game, that if a majority goes in one direction, I have to accept it, because that's where my people has decided we're going to take our country. And I hope to win the next election and change direction. No demos, no democracy. This is not about independence of it's a condition of democracy that there is a sense of demos. I'll give you an example. If you went to the Canadians and said, why don't you join the United States? You will be citizens with equal rights. A Canadian can be elected to be the president of the United States of America and Canada, etc. It will be fully democratic. Why wouldn't you do that? And the Canadian will say, thank you, but no thank you. We are Canadian and we want to rule ourselves, because that's what democracy deep down means. It's the rule by the people. We love you, but you are American, and we love ourselves a little bit more. What Trump has done, and that is the deep danger of polarization, which we see increasingly in so many countries, is to fracture the notion of the demos. You are not real Americans. You are traitors. That's the deep sense in which social polarization threatens democracy. Because I accept the discipline of majority rule because it's my people. But if I say you are not my people, you are betraying what it means to be an American, what it means to be Polish, what it means to be Spanish or whatever, the technology of democracy no longer works. No demos, no democracy. And the biggest harm that Trump, it's not in foreign policy, it's not in all these things. It's not even in trying to pretend that he didn't lose the election. It's in creating a division in the American people that threatens the notion of demos. And if that deepens and is not healed, woe to American democracy. And that is true for every country where we see this deep kind of polarization. Because democracy, if you think again, just a little bit, I am a professor, a little bit of democratic theory. It's very difficult to explain why we should accept that the majority can bind the minority. It's intuitive, but the majority might be stupid, the majority might be evil, the majority might be wrong. It's hard to explain. If you read from John Locke to Habermas, why do we accept this intuitive notion that in democracy the majority has the right to bind? It's hard to give an answer. But we can say it only works within a demos. When you have a demos, we accept that the majority can bind the minority because it's a decision of my people. When we threaten the very notion of demos, that's the deep threat to democracy.
May I push you a little further on this? You have now a rising power in China that has a very different history, that doesn't make references to John Locke or to other European thinkers, that draws inspiration from its own philosophical tradition going back a very long time. And they too proclaim themselves to be democrats. The translation for democracy in Chinese is exact to the Greek minchu, the people as rulers. But they feel that what that actually means in practice is different. And unlike the US, you talk about the visionary aspect of US self-perception. China has very little of it. Perhaps it's too old a civilization, it's a bit cynical. It feels that I have enough problem with my own family. Good luck to you. As long as you don't trouble me, I won't trouble you. If I can help, in little ways I will. So in a world which is fractured, is it not just as well that China has no missionary instinct? And maybe it's more like you and me, more pluralist. In that it accepts that, yes, you can be America, you can be Canada, it's okay. The world is big enough for all of us. We don't have to be like you. Whereas in the case of the Americans, sometimes they said, no, you must be like me. And they used to lecture Lee Kuan Yew. And Lee Kuan Yew got a bit frustrated. And more than once said, look, make me a 51st state, and I'll listen to you.
So, this American notion, which informed from time to time American foreign policy, the ugly way of putting it is regime change. We have to make Iraq democratic, we have to make Iran democratic, etc. I think they cured of that disease. In fact, because it always ended badly. It always ended badly. You can't force democracy on people. It has to come from within, and there are different forms of democracy. But I want to make two comments. The one is that they're disengaging too much. There's a feeling they don't feel the same kind of responsibility towards the world as well as towards America. It's make America great again. It's about us. And American foreign policy during the American century was it's about us, but we also have global responsibility. And that, I'm not worried that we will see another regime change little war, because they always failed in that. So it takes a long time for them to learn, but I think the Americans are learning that. I'm worried more by a disengagement, by the self-understanding, let's take care of ourselves and let the world take care of it. And that is not what characterized the American century. The second thing about China, China is China, but China is, what I said about any form of democracy, China would be just as worried as I am if the sense of it, the Chinese people fractured. Then they would be in real deep problems. It's not about a one-party state or non-one-party state, etc. If China fractures as a people, losing the sense we are Chinese, okay, the enclaves here and enclaves there, but if we see that kind of fracture, they will be in very deep problem. That proposition holds true even about so-called Chinese democracy. You require a sense of demos. Otherwise, you can't govern.
I think there was the lady from ID, yes, and then the mic will come around this way.
Thank you very much. My name is Yvonne. I'm from ABC. So I had a question for both Professor Byler and Professor and Mr. Joshua. So for Professor Byler, we discussed the kind of US political and economic power. I'm curious about your views on US soft power. How would you assess this? And for example, you mentioned that many Chinese are studying the US, so they will still get influenced by American culture and so on. So how will you assess the importance of US soft power? Is it in decline or is it still quite strong? And then to Mr. Yu, I understand you're also an expert on Chinese philosophy and have a deep interest in it. How would you assess the soft power of China or the rest of the world? Thank you very much.
So soft power to respective countries, US, China.
The concept of soft power is a European invention because they don't have hard power. But the classic American notion of soft power is Teddy Roosevelt. Speak softly but carry a big stick. That's the classic American thing. Speak softly but carry a big stick. And it doesn't work when you speak loudly and have a small stick. And that's what worries me. Speaking too loudly but losing credibility.
I think China has a different philosophy. If you have to use hard power, you are not very good. So this is in Bing Fa, in the Art of War, that the acme of high strategy is to be able to achieve your objective without the need for war. But you have to understand war. To prevent war, you must understand war. And if your plans assume that no one will attack you, then for sure you'll be attacked. But if your plans take into account the fact that you may be attacked, then you have peace. And in China's statecraft, there is an overwhelming preference for soft methods. The Americans call it economic coercion. But to the Chinese, economic coercion is much preferred to the deployment of military forces. And it's not economic coercion in the sense of I blockade you. No, it's I've got the world's biggest market, you are my neighbor. You need me more than I need you. You are my friend. The door's a little wider to you. In fact, I may even take some business away from other people and give it to you. But if you're my enemy, then the door will be a little close to you. And my people won't be affected because I'll just open the door wider in other directions. So the people who are targeted feel it, whether positively or negatively. And so their behavior changes. And they've applied it to all of us, including Singapore. And we all learn. So we learn, oh, okay, that's how they react. And to me, it's a much more sophisticated use of power than to say, if you don't do it, I will embargo you or sanction you or mount a coup or something. Yeah. This is Chinese statecraft.
Maybe the difference is not quite so big. We're in one of the most famous law firms in Singapore. So there's negotiations. Now what I teach my students is, if you go to court, you've lost. You have to have the negotiations that you don't end up in court. If you end up in court, you betrayed your client. But it only works when the other side to the negotiation knows that you're not afraid to go to court. And that's what pushes them to the compromise. And I think, so every time American uses force, you are right, George. In some ways, it's a failure. But I think the basic strategy, and that's why I go back to Teddy Roosevelt, it's because we carry a big stick, because the other side was saying, well, if we don't reach a compromise, they will take us to court, that you don't go to court and you reach a compromise. It's also about national character. Just think how many war movies you see coming out of Hollywood. Americans are fascinated by that. So there's a kind of almost a social attraction to look at all those Marvel movies, etc. It always ends in realization of power rather than it's there, but you don't use it. So to that extent, there really is a difference.
So the gentlemen have been waiting. So the mic will come to you.
Hi, Professor Weiler. It's a real treat. Jay Su from the National University of Singapore. I teach compliance and risk management, so this discussion that we're having today I thought was wonderful. And since I'm also a lawyer by training, I wanted to be brief. So I wrote out my question. I'm just wondering how your assessment and views this evening may differ or be open to change if you take into account three aspects. One, the rise of a friendly middle power, as they would call it, that is seemingly sympathetic to the United States. And by middle power, I mean the likes of Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, that are recipients of a huge amount of FDI in the form of technology, and we see it in the form of chips, the semiconductor industry. Two, the disenchantment with China, and as recently as today or yesterday when we talked and heard about the national security laws, which makes it open to companies that operate in China to face repercussions if they in any way have communications that impinge on China's national security. Three, given the rise of Iran and PPRK efforts in proliferation, some would say that China has been silent, others may say that it has been complicit. So I'm just wondering, in view of these three points, is it open to the US slipping into another decade that might be golden? And your views on that would be interesting. Thank you.
This is the time where a professor in the classroom says, "What do you think?"
I'm happy to give you my views too.
A very tough question. So, Mr. Yeo gave part of the answer. The instinct of American foreign policy when they're dealing with a Bangladesh or Vietnam, etc., is, are you with us on China or are you against us on China? And that's the prism through which they decide their policy. That's not as wise as the very long Chinese civilization. But I think that's part of the answer. It's always, are you with us or are you against us? And on the burning issue, and it might be China, it might be Ukraine, etc. And it's in some ways understandable, in some ways it's unproductive. You mentioned one thing about technology, which I didn't mention in my speech, but I want to mention it here. Look at the field of technology, especially information society, and we see a very interesting global development. So the major information society powerhouses are Americans, the Googles, the Amazon, the Facebooks, the Twitter, etc. And now artificial intelligence. It's American technology, etc. Europe doesn't exist there. The only countervailing force is Chinese, the Alibabas, etc. But the interesting thing is that America and its regulatory regime allowed the emergence, and with good results and with bad results. It's very difficult to judge us normatively. But they abdicated the regulation of the technology society to Europe, what we call a Brussels effect. So the power that produces the technology is the United States. The power that regulates the use of the technology is Europe, because America just had a hands-off approach. They missed an opportunity here in terms of, and this is also something that is changing the world, but it's an interesting little footnote to, I said, in the American century, Americans shaped the world economically, shaped the world politically, militarily, etc. Here we have the most important, it's the fourth industrial revolution, and with consequences which are very difficult to predict, negative and positive. So the United States produced the technology, but they are not shaping the regulation of this technology around the world. Isn't that curious? It's a hands-off approach. And Europe came in, and the GDPR and all the first regulation of artificial intelligence is going to come out of Europe. And the American platforms have to follow European law. When I teach my seminar on legal controls of digital platforms, most of the course is about European law, not about American law, because they are calling the shots when it comes to the regulation of the technology that develops in the United States. It's just a tiny little footnote. It's not an answer to your difficult question. I did my best, not very well. But it's just another little wrinkle in this shaping the world, etc. The American voice in the regulation of technology is weak. In the development of technology, it's very powerful. In the regulation of technology, it's very weak.
I think this is such a fascinating point that the old world civilizes the frontier in America. Never thought of it that way. I think that's a very powerful insight, which we should use to look at many of the issues before us today. For us in Singapore, we are price takers, so we've got to accept that the US is the US. We can't change it. We can't change Europe. We can't change China. And we develop a multi-channel capability. So when I was with Lynn and Elizabeth negotiating free trade agreements, we just work on the basis that every country is different. And you find win-win outcomes depending on who your partner is. Yeah. Maybe that's what it really means to be a pluralist. That you accept others for what they are and not think you can change them.
But I will tell you something. I'm a pluralist, you're a pluralist. There's a different way of saying it. We are old-fashioned liberals.
Yes.
And we are an endangered species.
Next question, yes, the gentleman, and then over here. So, yes, and yes.
Hi, good afternoon, Professor Weiler. It's been 12 years since I was a student. 12 years ago, when we were visiting the school uptown on the upwest side. Let me tell you from an observational standpoint, which is your favorite word in class, it's no less intimidating 12 years.
Did you get a good grade?
Thank you very much. Your rigor on the curve is noted. 3 very good questions. Like the best exams, we can pick to choose, pick to answer any of them. So first one is, on 9/11, how much do you think, as an explanation for the shifts that you have explained or you have discussed, does 9/11 as a direct attack on US soil explain that shift? Second one, again, very, very, very fascinating, the sucking of US consumption. How much did Reagan's change in the policy of making US a debtor country allow the sucking to continue? Because the perpetuation of the US economic power by the consumption power may have come to an earlier end, or if not soon from now. And the last one is, I remember at office hours I spoke to you about ASEAN 12 years ago. I wonder if your views on ASEAN in general have moved or developed since then. Thank you.
The student.
Let's start from the end of ASEAN. The usual mistake that is made when thinking of ASEAN is using the European Union as a model and then saying, look how ASEAN is a pale shadow of European integration. And that's a totally wrong observational standpoint. I'll give you an example where in some respects the ASEAN model is better than the European model. It's not constitutionalized. So in Europe, there's so many things that they could do and would want to do, but they look at the treaty, they go to the court, you're not allowed to do it, it's ultra vires, it's intra vires, you don't have the competences. ASEAN can and has done whatever it wants to do. Now, the problem is sometimes they don't want to do things. Sometimes they don't reach consensus, the famous ASEAN way. But nobody looks and saying, but look at the documents, we're not allowed to do it. If the heads of state and government get together and say it's in our interest to do it, they do it. They can't quite do the same thing in Europe. I think ASEAN has not achieved the kind of common market which it said it wanted to achieve. But if we look at supply chains, it's a big success. There's a very important supply chain flow among the economies of ASEAN. It's an open question whether there would be more or less prosperity if they really reached a common market. For Singapore, it's easy. You haven't had custom duties from your birth. A common market means countries have to give up their custom duties. And custom duties are not just important for revenue sources, they're important for protecting domestic industry, which is a short-term benefit, a long-term probably non-benefit. So we have to judge ASEAN in ASEAN terms. And I can recommend a paper by Professor Tan, who's sitting here, published in the European Journal of International Law, which gives you a much more realistic and insightful view how to think about ASEAN. You will be surprised. You will learn and you will become wiser by reading this. Now you have to remind me, you had 2 other questions.
9/11 and sucking and borrowing.
9/11 was a shock to the system. It was the first time that there was an attack on American soil, but it was a different type of attack, correct? It wasn't one state threatening the United States. So it's what we call these asymmetric worlds that we all live in fear of that. I'm sure that your security services are worried about a dirty bomb. Not an atomic bomb, just a dirty bomb that will spread radioactive, etc. So I think it was less of a shock to the system that appeared in the first year or 2 years or 3 years. So they strengthened anti-terrorism rules, etc. But it didn't, that in and of itself didn't dramatically change American posture. They had a little adventure in Afghanistan, which they left with their tail among their feet because they had to show the American people that we're doing something, etc. But I'm among those who said that it was terrible. My daughter's husband, his brother, was killed in the Twin Towers. So from a human, social, and sort of sense of security, it was terrible. But I'm not among those who said that was a watershed in American understanding of itself, etc. It just confronted America with terrorism, which Western countries were familiar with. France was familiar with, Italy was familiar with, Spain was familiar with. They all had these regular terrorist attacks which killed innocent people, etc. So America joined the club. Terrorism can also impact the United States. So 9/11 for me, from a cultural point of view, from a social point of view, was dramatic, but I don't think it radically changed American self-understanding, American understanding of its place in the world, etc. I fail to see the causal link to the processes that I've been describing. And your third question?
Reagan
American
borrowing,
consumption.
which allowed consumption to carry on, U.S. consumption to carry on.
Look, every time there's an economic scare, now we realize that half the American banks might be insolvent, shades of 2008, etc. It's still a robust economy. I can't get too excited by American debt. If push comes to shove and they introduce a federal sales tax, in 3 years they could rub out the debt. So it's always there. Politically it's difficult. It's a robust economy, etc. So the consumption can continue, except it doesn't, I repeat, it doesn't have the same power. It's 300 million American consumers against 1.5 billion Chinese and 1.2 billion Indian. Just the numbers tell. So when you are sucking up 2/3 of industrial goods in the world, that gives you a lot of power because their prosperity depends on your prosperity. Today, countries' prosperity depend less on American prosperity. The stability of the global system is still very much influenced by the United States. But if you look at export markets, etc., there's less a sense if America goes down, we go down together with them economically because so much consumption is happening in emerging economy, etc. It's this relative thing that changed. You remember I said there are two theses, actual American decline, but simply relative American power. And remember my example of if you were the CEO of Mercedes-Benz and I asked you, you have to give up either the American market or the Chinese market, you would probably say, I'll give up the American market and stick with the China. I don't think they will continue to be a consuming country, and in a way that's the strength of the American economy. You borrow and you pay your debts. Yeah? When you buy your next car, you will borrow. You will pay your debts.
But if I can just press this question a little. This exorbitant privilege which the US dollar enjoys, how long can you continue going on like this?
Well, if we ask ourselves the reason that the Europeans established the euro. So one reason is just transaction costs. The magazine, The Economist, did an exercise. They sent somebody from England with £100. He flew to France, he changed it into francs. Then he flew to Germany, changed the francs into Deutsche Mark. Then flew to Italy, changed it into lira. When he came back to the United Kingdom, it was 74 instead of 100, just by the transaction costs. So that was one reason, not the principal reason. There were two principal reasons. The one was the European Central Bank has a policy which no other central bank in the world has. It's one thing, price stability, no inflation. 2, 3 years ago, the European Central Bank, the European Central Bank, the European Central Bank has a policy which no other central bank in the world has. It's one thing, price stability, no inflation. 3 years ago, the European Central Bank, 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 the Euro That's it. It means a tight monetary policy. That's not popular in Europe. It's more kind of socialist, etc., welfare states, etc. So, but everybody was converted that we need a tight monetary policy because otherwise we will have runaway inflation. So if we transfer the competence to monetary policy to the European Central Bank, they will impose the tight monetary policy and politically we get re-elected. What can we do? It's the European Central Bank. The second reason, and this is why the French were pushing for it so hard, we need to have an alternative currency to the dollar. At least so far, it hasn't worked. All major commodities in the world are still priced in dollars. A barrel of oil is priced in dollars. How long that can last, I don't know. But it's lasted longer than we thought it would last. And one of the reasons it lasted longer because it's not just the strength of the American economy. If I trade in dollars, I in some ways preserve my value. It's because of the stability and the trust in the American system, etc. I think that's the strength of the dollar. If that stability and that trust diminish, there's a greater chance that an alternative currency will emerge. But it's not tomorrow and probably not even the day after tomorrow. The strength of the dollar as the reserve currency, as the currency of reference, is remarkable. Difficult to explain, but it's an empirical fact. Despite everything, people trust the dollar.
Now there are 20 more questions in the room here. So over here.
And I was telling Sandy, I said, there might be 2 or 3 questions. Don't stretch it.
So maybe we could.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Take 2 questions at a go and then.
That's above my pay grade.
Oh, sorry. Elizabeth? Yeah. So, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. You have the mic. Go ahead. Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Wheeler, for sharing with us. I just want to ask about the point about American polarization, which you addressed just now. And that having extended to foreign policy, some people may observe that as divided as America is, there's one thing that will unite both the Democrats and the Republicans, and in fact the whole of the United States, and that's the rise of China. So if you look at the US, at both the Congress level and at the national level, there's a general level of distrust towards the rise of China. So would you agree with the view that, ironically, the rise of China has united the United States?
To the extent that there's this kind of fear and anxiety and simply not wanting to lose the primacy that the United States enjoyed since the end of the Cold War, it does have a unifying force, but it doesn't solve our problem. Because, first of all, Americans are deeply parochial. The American pastime is baseball. So once a year, you have the competition between American teams and maybe 1 or 2 Canadian teams. And what is that called? The World Series. Americans are parochial. The world is between the Atlantic and the Pacific. They're very strong economically. In many respects, if they want to, they can be self-sufficient. They can certainly feed themselves. They can revive American. So, unless it's war, God forbid, there can be sort of, okay, Democrats and Republicans can come together on China, although even that is contentious now. What has to be done? The Republicans saying, oh, you're not doing enough, and some Republicans are saying you're doing too much because they're isolationist, etc. But that's not the problem of polarization in terms of geopolitics. Polarization in terms of geopolitics is the diminishment of the stability of American foreign policy. That a president can sign a treaty, and 2 years later, a new president can say, we are leaving that treaty. that you can negotiate a multilateral trade agreement, etc., and you don't know, is this as it should be? It can be annulled by consent of both parties, or is the next administration, because of domestic politics, can just turn its back on it? The polarization is that consensus. We can argue about taxes, and we can argue about school prayer, and we can argue about all these things. But when it comes to foreign policy, Congress votes 98-2. That's gone. And that's what's worrying countries like Singapore and countries like France, and all classical American allies. It's the stability of American foreign policy. That's, in geopolitical terms, that's what's worrying about American polarization. And the deeper worry is a real American crisis. I don't think there's going to be a civil war in terms of shooting at each other, but a real fractured society. That's not the America we used to observe. We used to observe America where there are very strong differences of opinion, but one accepts the democratic discipline. If the Democrats win the election, we have to live with this. If the Republicans win the election, we have to live with it. And that is being threatened. The actual legitimacy of American democratic institutions. And because it's America, this powerful state, etc., those internal developments, which if they happen in other countries, how worried are we getting because Macron is in trouble? We're a little bit worried. But when America is in trouble internally, it worries everybody, and rightly so.
Okay, so Elizabeth, and then the gentleman over there. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I have just two questions. The first one, I'd like to know what is your view on IPEF? I mean, it's quite, you were talking about how they were Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then now they're trying to move together the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, as a way to show economic leadership in this part of the world especially. And the second question maybe is a bit provocative. You talked about sleepwalkers. Instead of it being a nuclear war, what about rise of the robots? Since there's so much moving into AI, if we don't really take some control over it, people talk about ethical AI. Europe, you mentioned the Brussels effect, but is there anything, should we be concerned that we are sleepwalking as we let the machines slowly take over? Thank you.
So Biden's new economic policy, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Yeah.
Well, he's trying to recuperate what was lost during the Trump administration with the abandonment of all these things. He's not doing enough to restore the WTO, but he understands that American strength comes from cooperation, from being a major mover in these mega regional agreements, etc. Let's hope. But it goes back to my previous answer. Let's say he's successful. Let's say he mobilizes. Let's say the agreement happens. And let's say that Trump wins the next elections. What will happen then? You don't know, and I don't know. Look, the rise of artificial intelligence and robots, it's a serious concern to civilization. It's a serious concern to civilization in a variety of ways. But it's not directly an American China problem or an American etc. The only thing that is relevant to what I was invited to talk about today is that one would expect the United States to also be a major player in global regulation of artificial intelligence. And it's when I see American action in regulation of other aspects of the information society, it worries me. It worries me. Now, I want to say something. What is the explanation that the new technology is so American-dominated and not European-dominated? Here is one explanation. It's not the only explanation. It's finance, but especially American risk-taking. It's part of, one of my sons went to Stanford. if there's some Europeans in the room, when somebody graduates from a law school in Germany, for example, their dream is to be a Beamte, to work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, etc. Solid job, high prestige, etc. Half the class of my son at Stanford are startups. Half the class. Americans are risk takers. And it's the risk taking, both financial risk taking and technological risk taking, etc., which is both a strength but also a weakness, because sometimes the risks don't work out. And with artificial intelligence, it's worrying, because the policy should be determined by risk assessment. And what goes against American grain is, if we don't know, in this case, we should be cautious. And the American spirit is, let's do it, and if there's a problem, we will solve it. And with artificial intelligence, that might be a problem, because in some ways it's irreversible. But what I said you could read every day in the Financial Times.
Sure. And the gentleman over there.
Professor, thank you. I just have an observation and I ask about it. One observation is that people have a certain cognitive bias against China. So just now a gentleman was asking about the new national security law that China is going to be enacting against foreign companies. Well, if I'm not wrong, already in Singapore we have the Internal Security Act. Right? So what's so new about it? And in Singapore, if you vandalize, public property, you can be caned. The famous case is Michael Finn during the President Clinton time. And he pleaded and he said, no, the law is the law. So are we being more brutal? To me, no. Our law is our law. So cognitive bias is something that we have to learn to overcome. Not everything China do is so draconian, because we in Singapore do certain thing that is considered colonial, like hanging, like caning. But I think they all deserve it. So that's one observation I want to share with. So my question is about international law, because I think this is a College of International Law, so I'll ask about ICSID. ICSID is the investor-state treaty whereby the investor can take the state to court in an arbitration against its sovereign immunity. That's great. But in today's whereby the Paris Climate Accord comes about, and if a state feels that, okay, they want to sort of phase out, example, coal-fired power station, the investor can, based on ICSID, if that country is an investor, is a signatory of ICSID, to court for compensation. So how you view that going forward, this evolution will come about? Because there seems to be a conflict over time on the relevancy of ICSID. Because if I remember correctly, under RCEP, we don't have any ICSID arbitration clause. Thank you, sir.
Let's look for a minute at the history of bilateral investment treaties. Very popular, there are thousands of them. But they were very skewed, as we all know. They were skewed in favor of the investor. If you compare an investment treaty with a trade treaty, those of you familiar with the GATT, the WTO, there's an exception clause. Yes, here are the rules of trade, but if you have compelling reasons for public morality, public health, environmental protection, a whole range of public policy, you get an exception. You don't find the equivalent of Article 20 in the GATT in investment treaties. Why were they so popular? Because it was in the interest of the capital exporting countries to protect their investors. And the capital importing countries thought, well, if they were told, if you don't sign this agreement, you won't get investment. So they had their arm twisted and they signed these investment agreements. So now, the wheel has turned around. Because in the last 10, 15 years, for the first time, capital exporting countries were the subject of investment state dispute, where the defendant is not Vietnam or Malaysia or Argentina, etc. It's Germany or Switzerland or the United States, etc. And suddenly they say, oh, this is not democratic, and what about sovereign immunity, etc. So there's a new generation of investment treaties, but many countries are trying to withdraw from these things because suddenly when the boot is on the other shoe, we don't like it. Now, this raises the question, the problem you said. So Germany is the best example, a very responsible country and deeply committed to the rule of law. So they are negotiating withdrawal from bilateral investment treaties, but they put in their model of withdrawal from investment treaties, they're saying, we will withdraw, but it's for the future. Even if the treaty doesn't exist, investors in Germany who operated under the protection of the treaty should be compensated, should get relief, etc. Not every country will follow those models. So, there have been about between 900 and 1,000 investment disputes, of which 600 the plaintiffs were European corporations. As long as the plaintiff was a European corporation, it was fine. When it's reversed, it's suddenly not fine. The right way in terms of the rule of law is to protect investors who invested under the protection of the treaty. Whether all countries who are trying to move out of this regime will follow the German model, I'm not so sure, but they should. I'm not sure it answers your question, but it's the best I can do.
Lack of what? Regulation by the Americans. My sense is that Americans precisely don't want to regulate because their philosophy is let it bloom, let the Facebook and the Googles and OpenAI develop, and that's how they establish themselves as a new type of superpower. So that's really just a comment, but of course if you want to
And
respond.
I kind of agree with you, but with one little footnote on the comment, then ask the question. The little comment on the footnote, what does it mean when we say America doesn't want to regulate? So who is the America we're talking about? And we know that the American legislative process and regulatory process, like many countries, is subject to special interest. And the special interest of the technology sector is extremely powerful. It's shifted a little bit. Suddenly, Congress is getting interested. There are important cases before the Supreme Court. But it's mainly because of the whole Twitter flap, etc. It's for the wrong reasons. But you are right. Americans are anti-regulatory because they encourage risk-taking. It's part of the same spirit I was talking about. It's a risk-taking environment. It's a risk-taking, and it goes down to the individual. Think about it, from a class, 50% of the class are in startups. Startups are risk-taking. It's not a solid job. You take a risk. My son took a risk and then he kind of caved in and joined Google. There's no risk.
Thank you, Professor. My query was, it goes back to your comment about the Americans and their tendency to look at the world through the prism of you're either with us or against us. And I worry that with the developments you described at the end of the American century and the rise of China, that only exacerbates the tendency, as Mr. Yeo said, you go around the region in ASEAN and Asia Pacific saying, are you with us? If you are, then we can talk military, we can talk business, and so on. So my question is, how long can Singapore survive as someone that is treading water between both superpowers? And it's no secret that Singapore, we adopt a principled stance and we say, look, we want to deal with the US, but we also welcome China's influence. Is that tenable in the long run? And how long can we tread water between these two superpowers before something happens to crush us on the floor?
I'm sure that question was addressed to the minister.
Singapore is always a balancing act. And, it helps if we have ASEAN to hide behind. So, in my years in MTI and MFA, ASEAN has always been our first circle of interest. It gives us more room to maneuver. Right now, there's a sweet spot, and we can find space to balance ourselves. But one day, that spot may disappear, then we must decide on which side to jump. We should never say what we're thinking, but mentally we must be prepared.
Satisfied with the answer?
I think with one last question, the gentleman over here.
I have a
Please, not a very hard question.
comment in a very easy question. I think America will still be a very successful country, and as you have said, Americans have lost their enthusiasm for the missionary role. So that's not what America is going to be about. I was just reading The Economist, and in 1990, America accounted for a quarter of the world's output. 30 years on, that share is almost unchanged. And today it accounts for 58% of the G7 GDP, compared with 40% in 1990. And there's a whole lot of other statistics, like the number of patents more than China and Germany put together. $100 put into the S&P in 1990 would be $2,000 today, 4 times what they would have been if they had been invested anywhere else in the rich world. I think it is very hard to understand America, and I should know that better than most people in the audience. I lived there for many years. I have 3 children who spend most of their lives in America, and I have 4 grandchildren who spend all their lives in America. And yet it is very hard to understand America. But there's no other country like America. And it's quite hard to understand our neighbors in ASEAN. It's quite hard to understand a little bit further neighbor China, or any other country for that matter. So why do we try so hard to understand America, which in my mind is the most complex country in the world? But I think America's influence is going to change, but it's not going to diminish, because it comes from what America is, the diversity. I mean, if you look at all those startups that you mentioned, and how many of those startups are led by, either started or led by non-Americans who came from all over the world. That cannot happen in China, that cannot happen in almost anywhere else in the world. And so it's not like 50 years ago, where America tries to bring democracy to other parts of the world. But I think American influence is not going to wane. It's going to change, because there are lots of people who still want to go to America. They're not going to go to China because they know they would never be able to lead a major Chinese company. They could lead a major American company. They could even stand for elections, or their children could stand for elections, like the 2 persons who declared themselves to stand for the Republican primary are communists. So America has a lot of strength, which is hard for us to understand. So I think, do you agree that maybe we should just stop worrying so much about America and let Americans be America? They're still going to be very powerful, and they're still going to be attractive to the rest of the world, more than any other country, at least as far as I can see it.
It's a good last question. First of all, it enables me to say for the 4th time, don't write off America. It's a powerful country economically, it's a powerful country in terms of hard power. And I confess, I wouldn't like to live anywhere else. With all its defects, etc. It's a great place, but that's Singapore. Probably a Singaporean would say, I wouldn't like to live anywhere else. My second comment is, whether you like it or not, Americans will be American. The ability of the world to shape America is probably a little bit less than the ability of the Americans to shape other countries. So you don't have to worry, let Americans be Americans. But my thesis was different. My thesis was, for all the reasons I explained, that the role that America played in shaping the world in which we live is not what it used to be. And it's not letting America being America, etc. It's just a sober look at the geopolitical reality, where For 100 years, we lived in the American century, which provided a modicum of stability, a modicum of trust, certain set of values, etc. And America was the major player in shaping the basic rules in which the world was operating, also in containment. And that has substantially weakened. I really think, in that respect, the American century is over. So they will continue being American. And if New York is also a great place.
I live there.
So you know, I'll tell you something about New York, which is very special. I don't know any other place in the world that is like that. You can get off the plane. You're coming from Singapore. Let's say you speak with a strong Chinese accent. And somebody meets you in the street one day after you arrived and asks you, where are you from? And you say, I'm from New York. That's the end of the story. You are 100% New Yorker. Nobody will say, where are you really from? What do you? No city in the world is like that. You arrive in New York, you say, I'm a New Yorker, you accept it as a New Yorker for all intents and purposes. That doesn't happen in Madrid, that doesn't happen in Spain, that doesn't happen in Singapore, that doesn't happen anywhere else. New York is special in that respect. Talking about pluralism, you can be a black lesbian Catholic. There will be a bar for black lesbian Catholics. Only in New York. So it's a good place to live with, despite all its problems. But it doesn't change the fact that the American role in the world has changed.
And on that very pluralist, old-fashioned liberal order note, let's thank Professor Weiler.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you really thoroughly enjoyed this buffet. I don't think we could have asked for better speakers. This is why International Law Association Singapore branch exists. We care what's our worldview, where does the law fit in, and why do we do what we do as lawyers? And today you answered these questions and more, or maybe raise more questions to sober us up. Let me just say a little bit about the network. We are a very cool, unique platform. Many of our members are here today. Practitioners, government officials, and of course academia. Thank you so much for NUSCIL for always working with us. We look forward to many of you joining our network. We look forward to having you at our future events. Please plug in. We don't just care about interacting and getting to know each other, but also about shaping the landscape of international law. Thank you. And on that note, thank you so much to ENG for your generosity.
Yes. Paris, and thank you to everyone. Please enjoy the reception. Have a good evening.